lucky today to be joined by Todd Pope, the CEO of TransEnterix, and Dr. Campbell Rogers, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Heartflow, which might seem initially like a bit of an odd combination to have essentially a software company and a robotics company together, but it turns out these guys go way back and they had worked together at Cordis years ago. So once again, MassDevice is a uniting factor. So Todd, I wanted to start with you and talk about how TransEnterix had its origins in surgical instrumentation, and at some point during your tenure you decided to really make the switch to robotics. And I wanted to explore a little bit about what went into that decision and how it was making that transition.
Sure. When we started the company, we were really like many medical device companies, a disposable instrument, single use. And I really felt like about 8 years ago that the industry would be moving more toward on surgical tools, being less of a tool sale and more of a system sale. As we started looking at robotics becoming more and more popular, I think when you look at a robot in the operating room, most people just ask me, well, how many robots are you going to sell? How much does the capital cost? But if you think about a robot, it's a console, it's an image processor, it's a video camera, it's arms, and it's all the instruments that go into that, in addition to all the software and the analytics. So when we sell a robotic system in today, it's kind of what we envisioned when we made that pivot. We pretty much go in and we put a vision system in with our robot. All the instruments, we have over 50 instruments that are approved to go on the end of our robot. So people, ORs aren't buying the individual instrument, they're buying more of a system. So you peel back 7 or 8 years ago, it wasn't that popular of a concept back then, but I really felt like the industry would move away from buying instruments individually, and it would be more of a system, kind of a workflow environment. And that's was really our vision. It's taken a while to get there, but that's starting to play out now.
So your initial product was the Surgibot, and you had quite a road to travel with that. I was hoping you could give us a little insight on the history of that and sort of the lessons learned from your journey with the FDA there.
Sure. You know, our first product when we started the company was a disposable, a spider is what it was called, but it was a single port device that was disposable. It could be used in all type of abdominal and pelvic surgery. And we got this idea that we just spoke about of having more of a robotic or system cell. We really took that disposable product and kind of let it grow up into a surgical robot, the Surgibot. The challenging thing with the FDA, and it wasn't all the FDA's fault, the only robot that had been approved was the Da Vinci back in 1999. So when we were talking to the agency almost 20 years later, there had not been anyone else approved. So the first thing they did was to have a public forum to have everybody come and weigh in, like, what do we think now 20 years later? How should we evaluate a robot? What should be the predicate? What type of instrumentation should we use as our predicate as we think about a new system? And technology had moved forward so far. So the Da Vinci as the predicate was a 510K, so we were going to be a 510K. But I think it's always that question of what type of data are you going to turn in with your 510K? I would say 9 out of 10 510Ks, if not a little bit more than that, do not have human data. That was the feedback that we were given. We didn't need that, and we didn't turn human data in. But at the end of the day, there was still a lot of questions that they had, some of which just couldn't be answered with preclinical data. So when we got our NSE back in April 2016, our next platform that we decided to file with the FDA, we just made the decision, really no matter what feedback we were getting from them, we were going to turn in human data. We had a good system. We had a CE mark in Europe. We had a lot of clinical data on hand, and we decided to turn in almost 200 patients in a pretty extensive clinical data set, and we got approved in 6 months. So I think it was a journey. I think everyone was learning. I think the agency was trying to determine what's the best way 20 years later to think about approving a robot, because so much technology had come onto the scene. So I think we both learned, but since then we've continued to get approvals. We just got approval in October of last year for our main system, the Senhance, but we've since had indications for use expanded and other instruments approved. So I think we're on more of an operating rhythm with the agency, and that'll pave the way for others in the future, I'm sure.
I was just going to ask if you're worried about others now being able to use you as a predicate with closer technology?
Well, I'm not worried. I think any segment as big as robotics, I don't think any of us can go a day or two without hearing about robotics in some form of our life, and certainly in healthcare, I think we're going to see a big proliferation of robotics in the med-surg space. Personally, I think it's a challenging business to get into because it requires a lot of capital and time, and we've been working on it, every day for the last 8 years. So I think it's good that others are coming, but I think the bar's pretty high, and it'll just take others time, and we have head start, and we'll see what we end up doing with it. But I think, look, technology, other people coming into the market, that's ultimately good for the patients. That's what we want. You don't want any of these segments being, a monopoly. It's not the right dynamic. So I think the more companies get involved in robotic space, the patients are ultimately going to benefit, and that's good.
So where do you see as the next frontiers of medical robotics?
Well, if anyone was in this room that works at our company, they would roll their eyes because I say this so much, but I would say that day to day, all of us interface with so much technology that we don't even think about. Our cars today have crash avoidance. They have cameras throughout. They can slow the car down when you're in cruise control. If you're going to back into something, it no longer just beeps, but it can actually apply the brakes. Those are all what I call augmented intelligence, and those are technologies that exist in our day-to-day life. Not many of those exist in the OR because it's a highly regulated environment, and most of the technology companies that we all think of that bring interesting technology to our smartphones or our cars or our homes, they don't operate in a regulated environment. So I think the next 5 years, what we want to do at TransEnterix, and I'm certainly sure others do, we're not inventing any new technology. We're just taking this technology that we live with day in and day out and try to bring it into the operating room. And I think that's going to be, the biggest jump for, medical robotics.
Campbell, turning to you, can you just give us a quick primer on Heartflow? I think it's been about 2 years since we were last on a stage like this. Yeah. Where have you come since then, and where are you going?
Yeah, you bet. Just as a quick introduction, Heartflow is a software as a service technology which operates in the world of cardiology and cardiology diagnostics. And for those not familiar, it may come as a little bit of a surprise that for the #1 killer in the world, certainly in this country and in the world of coronary artery disease, the ways in which people are diagnosed are relatively crude, meaning that by the time someone gets to the invasive side of diagnosis in the cardiac catheterization lab, the chances they actually need to be there are about 50-50. So that's the fundamental problem. It's a little surprising because it's such a common disease. Surely the way we diagnose it and triage people has got to be really well refined, right? And the answer is no, it's not. And what traditionally has been done is people have used stress tests, and I'm sure people in the room, probably virtually without exception, have had or know family members or friends who've had stress tests, and many probably have gone on for invasive procedures. What our technology does is it operates in a way that allows physicians a much more precise tool to decide, with which to decide which patients need to go for invasive evaluation and often treatment with stents or with bypass operations or what have you. And the way our technology works is we take cardiac CT scan data, which are done millions of times a year around the world. Those image sets come to Heartflow, and we perform an analysis which is largely automated, not entirely, but largely, and then we return information back to the physician so that he or she can then incorporate that into planning for the patient. So it's software as a service. We get image sets, and we return back data that speaks to the functional importance of coronary disease. What's the journey? When we were last talking a couple of years ago, we had gotten through the FDA hurdles, and we're embarking on a whole series of activities, clinical studies and activities in the payer domain. This really is with a technology who's predicated on value, providing value to the healthcare system. So engaged in payer campaigns, and since then we've had quite a bit of success in that domain and are now in a very rapid commercialization phase, which is quite different than it was a couple of years ago.
So what's your biggest lesson learned from walking the reimbursement path?
There have been a few. I guess probably the most central is that despite outward appearances, it's actually a pretty rational process. Right? You think of payers and insurance companies or government payers in the U.S. or overseas, and that it seems often arbitrary and not rational. In point of fact, it's actually really rational. The decisions are made by really smart people whose primary role is, A, to provide good care for whoever their beneficiaries or citizens are, and the second is to make sure they do so in a cost-efficient way. And they like to hold on to their money. And if there isn't a good, compelling reason to spend money on a new technology, they're kind of reluctant to do so. It's rational. You know, the second lesson is that we've spent a lot of time gathering clinical data. And the clinical data has been geared from the very beginning, not just to show what the clinical impact is, but also, you know, consciously saying, how are we going to measure the effect on the healthcare spend associated with this disease state? Capturing those data early on so then it can be presented to payers in a way that they understand, with metrics they understand, has been a kind of a core guiding principle from early on, and that's the second lesson.
Okay. So what are the next steps for Heartflow, and how are you going about sort of scaling this?
Yeah, with a lot of trepidation. It's growing very quickly, and we're expanding our team. You know, the next steps are to continue to try to win the hearts and minds of our customers, who are cardiologists and primary care providers. And the second is, and this is another sort of interesting area, is as our product, which changes really often, and you know, there's a whole machine learning aspect to it, which is we get tons of data. We have tens of thousands of CT scans, and the product learns and gets better. How do we navigate the regulatory pathways with the FDA to say we have a product which actually could change pretty much daily? It doesn't, because we do it in, you know, in bundles to meet FDA requirements. But how to navigate that is a really important aspect, not so much for scaling, to your question, but for our path forward.
Right. So you mentioned sort of winning the hearts and minds of physicians, and I wanted to sort of throw that open to the both of you to comment on. How do you go about climbing that mountain and convincing a group of physicians who are used to doing things a certain way because they know they achieve the outcome they want, that this newer thing and the shiny new toy is actually going to help improve their practice?
Go ahead. Okay, I'll go. For us at TransEnterix, we are targeting laparoscopic surgeons. So a laparoscopic surgeon, he or she is standing up beside the patient. They're typically in a difficult ergonomic position, but that is the way they've done laparoscopic surgery for the last 30 years. And frankly, I was fortunate enough to be with Ethicon Endosurgery when we really launched that in the early 90s, and that market has become a $15 billion market, give or take. So when you're talking about hearts and minds, we're trying to get that laparoscopic surgeon to leave the patient side and sit at a console outside the sterile field. So I think you have to have some very viable, demonstrable benefits to show them. And early on, a lot of surgeons say, well, I don't really need extra technology. I'm fairly efficient at what I do. But when you actually get them, you know, sitting down in a chair, something like this, and their arms are relaxed, and instead of making these big gross movements, they're making very small micro movements. They feel very comfortable throughout the procedure. They are able to have 3D vision, so they can see tissue planes like they've never seen before. They're able to reach parts of the body and do certain suturing where they really could not get their hands otherwise. So it all of a sudden becomes a very, very viable, demonstration of how they feel like they personally can be better. And I think that's something that's a little different for us. We always lead with clinical benefits for the patient, and certainly we have lots of those with robotics for sure. But we have this new dynamic, at least in the U.S., over the last 8 or 10 years, as many of you realize, more of the surgeons are now employees of the hospital or the hospital system. In the past, the way MedTech sold is we would go and get a clinical champion, and if they were very vociferous, they would go and they could probably get a product in. And now, as employees, they don't have as much, unilateral power. But what's interesting is we used to talk to hospital executives about ergonomics of the surgeon, and they didn't really, value that much. But now that these surgeons are employees or assets, they want them to be healthy. They want them to not be out on short-term disability, because many surgeons in America do get physically worn down over the years. Cardiologists standing up, surgeons. So winning the hearts and minds is not just of the surgeons, but it's also of the people making the decision in the hospital. And for us, we've had to learn how to take our technology and not only talk about first how it benefits the patient, second, how the surgeons can benefit, but third, the hospitals that are actually acquiring this technology, they're much more interested in a broader decision criteria than they had in the past. And we've had to adapt to that.
Now, Senhance, correct me if I'm wrong, but it does have a haptics component. Is that a helpful hearts and minds, nice to have or must have?
We think it is. What most people don't realize today is current robotics has no sense of feel or touch. They just have their hands on the instruments and they're watching a screen. And Campbell and I haven't talked about this, but I know as a cardiologist, the sense of feel and a touch is fairly important, and certainly in surgery too. Today, even if they have their hands on instruments in regular laparoscopic surgery, they're palpating tissue, they're seeing if there's a bone down there, they're evaluating tissue masses. So to not have that, we felt like would be a big drawback. So one thing that we wanted to do with Senhance is we wanted to give them full haptic feedback. If they're manipulating tissue, if they're grabbing, if they're suturing, we want them to give that full sense of touch. It's just like if you're tying your shoe, you can really do it without watching because it's the way you feel, and that's the way a lot of times tying suture is. Without that feel, it's difficult. So we actually did not launch for a couple years until we perfected that. And as Campbell said, a lot of people told us we weren't going to be able to get that through the FDA because every surgeon might decipher a sense of touch or feel a little differently, but I think they overwhelmingly felt like having some sense of touch would be safer and more repeatable. So the Senhance does offer that, and that certainly is one of the things that's certainly helped us get the attention of surgeons. When you remove them from the sterile field, you want to give them as many senses as they can, and the sense of touch is a big one.
So for you, what's your strategy of attracting these key opinion leaders?
Yeah, it's really amazing how many similarities there are. The first, of course, is the clinical value proposition. So it's no physician on the face of the earth is going to do something that's not as good or better for his or her patients. But that's kind of the ticket in. The second is, how does it make that physician's life better? That could be economic, could be in their efficiency, and for us, that's efficiency in the cath lab. For interventionalists, to know that if they go in with the patient, they're going to actually do something therapeutic, not just do a diagnostic test and then walk out. And then the third is, again, back to the economic piece, is because so many of them are now employed, physicians are employed by hospitals, just as Todd said, that allows a conversation at the service line level to say, this is a technology which will be better. Your payers are pushing it. You as a physician have a lifestyle benefit, and your patients are better. So it's having those three things come together, and honestly, the employment piece is facilitating in that regard, not a barrier. I expect we're finding the same thing. So.
Yes.
So I think we have some extra time here for questions from the audience. If anyone has a question for our distinguished panel, we'll get someone with a microphone to get over and field any questions. No? Bueller? Anyone?
To get payers to behave in a rational manner, you have to show up with data. But how do you get to the spot that you can have that data, to have that conversation? That there's a bit of a chicken and egg there. And so while they may be rational, how you cross that chasm, I'm curious if you don't mind talking a little bit about the experience of Heartflow to get it off.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The step that I left out is kind of like finding KOLs to be clinical champions, finding early adopter payers. And they're all different types of payers. There are early adopter types who you can identify, and they're known. And going to them, getting them to say, yeah, I'm really interested in new technology, tell me about it. And then get them to say, okay, and actually we're going to help you gather some data in our population, which will be compelling to other payers. So as a specific example, we did that with a group, a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan in Pennsylvania, which is called Highmark, which is part of a big IDN with Allegheny. So it's an integrated system. They're known for being early adopters. We went to them. They said, yep, we'll pay you for your product. We're going to use our claims data, and we're going to see what happens. And it turns out their data actually mirrored what our trials had shown, they published it. They went out to all their sister Blues plans, and it became a little bit, there was a game of telephone which occurred after that. The second sort of step was not to just think in the US, but we went to the UK and worked with NICE, which is the HTA for the NHS in the UK, very early. They were very interested. They actually reached out to us because of their focus on trying to save money for a really crippled NHS system. And they, by gaining their approval, that was really impactful in the US because they have such a brand of being thoughtful assessors of technology. So once we got their backing, that meant a lot in our conversations here with sort of not so early adopting plans in the US. Just a couple of specific examples.
You want to get in on this?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, for our company with data, with the 510K, you're not going to have nearly as much data as you do with the PMA. Campbell and I worked on, you know, a PMA product at Cordis in years past. But I think the agency is starting to be more and more open to post-market data assessment. So we were fortunate enough to have a CE mark first. We turned in a lot of, you know, clinical data and got approved. But we're continuing to open a registry so we can file more of our cases. And I think we're going to try to move with the agency to go back and get expanded indications and more of this data, post-market surveillance. And I think the FDA wants to be more and more open to that. I sit on the Advomedic Cell Board. We work with the FDA, with MEDUFA, and trying to have a good partnership. And that's one thing besides consistency and transparency. We're also seeing if we can lighten the burden a little bit on the front end and have people follow up with post-market data. And I think that's a good trend.
Yeah, so right now the hospital, they are just trying to save the money, and the robotic devices are very expensive. So, and then recently the hospital have to spend money on the EMR system, so it costs a lot of money for this hospital. So right now they are just trying to save the money. So how the robotic devices could save the money for the hospitals?
That's a great question. There was another kind of core direction that we wanted to take at TransEnterix, and this is all public information. If you look at the robotics out there today, it costs about $1,800 per procedure. That's a public figure. But most of that is because those instruments have a limited use. We saw that in laparoscopic surgery, most instruments have gone to be reusable. So it was a little unconventional for us because there's a classic razor blade model that many capital companies take. But we elected to make the majority of all of our instruments reusable. So by doing that, you can amortize the cost of the instruments, and it takes our cost per procedure down to around $300. So if you compare that to $1,800 to $300, we can really be at parity with their laparoscopic cost and still bring a lot of value. So we won't be as profitable as some companies in a typical razor blade model, but what we believe is we can capture many more procedures, because today, 20 years after robotics has been approved, and I'm kind of talking soft tissue robotics, you know, abdomen and pelvis, there's only about 5 to 6% of the surgery that's moved over there. As much as we hear about robotics and as much value has been created, and there's a lot of excitement, still has been low single-digit conversion. And I think a lot of that is to your point on per procedure cost. When you buy a robot, you've got a capital budget in a hospital, but you've got an operating budget in the OR that you've got to lay on top of reimbursement. And so we have got a different way to go at that with reusable instruments. We're going to keep cost per procedure low, and we believe in the long run we'll get a lot deeper penetration and more higher volume, lower reimbursed procedures. But that's where the bulk of surgery is. So that's the way we're tackling it at TransEnterix. And I'm sure other companies that come out will look at it in their own way. But we felt like you had to get per procedure costs down for the technology adoption to really take off.
Could you talk a little bit about the investor community and their attitude towards capital requirements for clinical data for 510K devices?
Sure, I think so. Our investors from the very beginning, I mean, in the cardiology space, you back up, is a space in which the clinical data is a core part of is a core deliverable, really, for every device, every product. You know, our investors from early on were aware of the need for perhaps more data than might otherwise be considered, because of the need for the payer community, and also because it's such a disruptive pathway to something that's been done, you know, as Todd said about laparoscopic surgery, it's been done a certain way for decades, and it's really ingrained. In order to get clinicians to change, they really need data, which is right, which is kind of what you would want. So I would say, you know, our investors at Heartflow, we're very fortunate. They've been incredibly willing to invest in clinical data way beyond the sort of size and scale of our company early on. You know, the big, I'll give you the following example, the big cardiac CT equipment manufacturers, who are GE and Siemens and Philips and Canon. Our spend on clinical data on an annual basis as a little company early on was orders of magnitude more than the combination of all of those big cardiac CT manufacturers whose machines are used for cardiac CT, which is our raw material. And just because that was the water we had to carry. So yeah, there was willingness, and we were fortunate for that. And I think the return on that has been good. The return on that investment's been good.
Yeah, I would think on 510K surgical devices, there's a little bit of a quandary, and it's probably getting at the essence of your question. With a 510K product, the barrier's lower to get it approved, but you still have to build a prototype. It has to work. You have to do preclinical data. You have to be able to get IP. You have to be able to build a team. It has to work, and then you have to go get it approved. But then you have to go execute and sell and get it in through the VAT committees and build a commercial team. So I think investment has been a little reticent to go into some of these 510K devices just because so much execution risk still remains after approval. But I do think we're seeing, I've got a little bit of unique viewpoint because we were venture backed. We did a Series A, we did a Series B, but I knew we were going to have to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to compete in the robotics market, and so we decided to go public. And so I believe the positives of being public is there's a lot more capital available for companies like ourselves, but then, you know, the scrutiny and the quarterly, you know, a mantra of trying to make your numbers kind of comes along with that. But for us, we were able to get good venture backing early, but the way I looked at it and we talked to the board, there was one robotic company out there that was public and their market cap was over $60 billion. And I thought, you know, it's the only house in the neighborhood. We could maybe build a little ranch over here on the cul-de-sac. It's going to be a pretty good comp. And, you know, so that's the way we got the energy to get out and go public. And I think over the last year or two, it's been a much better market for device companies on the public sector. There's been some good IPOs. People have been doing good secondaries. And I think that bodes well for investors when VCs can see a company not only having to be acquired to be able to generate value, but can also have an opening to go public. That's another value creator that I don't think that window's been as open for med device companies over the last 5 years that it has been maybe the last 18 months.
Any more questions? I got one for you, Todd.
Okay.
I want to get back to the haptics. How does that work? What's the mechanism of that? How do you get the feedback through the console and back to the physician?
Well, if I told you that. No, it is, most of our technology that we've incorporated into our robotic system has come from other industries. I'll answer your question on haptics in a moment, but one of the biggest quandaries with laparoscopic technology is you only have two hands, so a surgeon operates. So typically what happens is they're operating, another person's holding the camera just like this, and they're driving it. So it's very frustrating for a surgeon to not be able to drive their own vision. And that's been a problem for 20 years. It's the problem with robotics. We incorporated technology out of the PC industry. Every laptop has a little camera, and we all know some of the pros and cons of that. But that also can view where you're looking on a website. So some of these big companies like Google, how do they decide how they're going to charge ad revenue? It's where you look on the screen and how long you gaze. And so there's a way to track your retina. It's the way that fighter pilots fly planes. They can only have their hands and their feet to control things. There's a lot more things they need to control, so you can control it by eye tracking. So what we do with our robot is people can operate a right and left-hand instrument, but they also can press a button, and wherever they look on the screen, the third robotic arm will move the camera. So it allows them to simultaneously move 3 robotic arms at the, at the same time, which is a big advantage, but it was just simply taking technology from another industry and bringing it into medical and robotics. And that's what we've done with the haptics. Believe it or not, we have been able to license some technology from the video game industry. Video game industry is very adept at console-based, and they have a lot of haptics. And it's a multi-billion-dollar business. A lot of people don't think about it that way, but we're console-based. The surgeon sits at a console. They have joysticks, and they're looking at a screen. So we've been able to license some of that technology over, and it's amazing with more chip computing power, we're able to get more and more finite touch and feel for these surgeons, so they can actually feel if tissue has a bone behind it or if it might be friable tissue. So we've been able to continue to dial that in, but it's all been taking technology from other industries and try to license it into medical.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Oh, there's someone in the back. Thank you.
Sorry, it's a long walk. So it's about modeling and simulation. So I was wondering, for HeartFlow, where do you see this going next? Because there's also many other applications for other parts of the body. So if you've thought about what is the vision of HeartFlow. And for Todd, I was wondering if you, maybe you mentioned this, but what do you use modeling and simulation to virtually for training purposes, also for testing of these robots? So how do you use that? I'd be interested. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. For the first part of your question, so there are 2 different axes that we are moving along. One is different parts of the body, different vascular trees that lend itself to the same kind of computational fluid dynamic work that we do. So that's one. And they include lower extremity disease, carotid disease, renal, intra-abdominal, mesenchymal arteries. The second, which is actually a little more on the front burner for us, is in procedural planning. So at present, we model the image as it's taken in a patient, and we provide information back. In the current state of affairs, here's what is going on with your patient. The next step is, if you were to change this, what would happen to your patient? And that's where we actually have very active work now. For example, is if there's a narrowing in an artery in the following way, if that narrowing is fixed, for example, with a stent or with a bypass graft, how much better is the patient? Does it make sense to do that for this patient? And especially in the coronaries, that's not always an easy answer, simply looking at an angiogram. An angiogram may look the exact same, and in one person fixing that blockage may be life-saving or symptom-reducing, and in the next patient it may not. So we have tools in development which will allow physicians, for example, in the cath lab, to say, yep, I need to fix that one and that one, but not that one. And if I do fix it, here's what the outcome will be.
Yeah, and I would say for us, we use simulation really in 2 ways. First, in our product development. In the old days, we used just to build everything. Then we used 3D printers. And now we can simulate all that. We can put a surgeon on 2 handles, and we can give them 8 to 10 different simulated handles. And so we can kind of evaluate their ergonomics. Would they rather turn the knob like this or with their index finger, or would they rather just rotate their whole hand? And so we can simulate that and get a lot of feedback quickly instead of having to build everything. So we use a lot of simulation in our R&D. And to your question more specifically, we certainly do a lot of simulation on training. Gone are the days that we're going to do see one, do one, teach one. And the preclinical model, I think, is even a little outdated. Now that technology has come far enough, we can simulate all of our haptic feedback. We can clearly get someone on a console with a simulated laptop plugged into it in a screen and simulate everything that they would come in contact with in surgery. We no longer have to have a model and all the robotic arms. And what Campbell was saying, we can actually load in actual cases, and with machine learning, we can let people actually experience complications and whatnot, all in a simulated environment. And so oftentimes we have surgeons, I think, going in much more prepared than they were just a few years ago, because they don't have to learn as they do. They can learn in a simulated environment, and then oftentimes maybe do 100 cases simulated before they do their first human case, and that's good. That's good for patients. So we're incorporating it both in R&D and training.
Well, with that, I think we've used up our allotted time. I want to thank you both. It's been wonderful having you. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll all stick around for the wonderful companies that are about to present in our MedTech showcase from MassMedic. And how about a nice round of applause for our great guests.
Thank you.